Morning folks, and welcome to today's episode. It's called Friendster, How They Blew It. And I love this story. It has everything. Jonathan Abrams, a young, smart coder from Canada. He moved to California because he wanted to be at the very heart of the internet boom. And on nothing more than an intuition, a feeling for how things should work online, he comes up with the framework for a social media platform. The very first one, and the very same model that MySpace, Facebook and all the others that they then learnt and copied really. But Abrams and Friendster, they were the first, and for a brief moment they were the hottest property in Silicon Valley. Google tried to buy them, VCs, they were desperate to invest in them, but within just a few months it all fell apart, leaving the door wide open for MySpace and then Facebook. It's a fascinating story. Enjoy. So we start with Jonathan Abrams, born in Toronto, Canada in 1970, father a research scientist, his mother an artist, and Abrams got into computers at a very early age, went on to study computer science at university, graduated and started working for Nortel in Ottawa, writing code. And back then Nortel, they were the dominant telecoms equipment maker. Now, at this time, two very important things happened in Abrams' life. The first, he read the book Startup, a Silicon Valley adventure by Jerry Kaplan, which I'd never heard of. And I'm going to go off on a little tangent here because I think it's worth digging into this book a little bit. It tells the story of Kaplan's company, Go Corporation, in the late 1980s. Basically, Kaplan was developing an iPad-type concept with its own operating system. So in doing so, his company went up against Microsoft. And I love this line from the book about when Microsoft came after them. He said, "The good news is that we have Microsoft on the run. The bad news is they're running in our direction." And by all accounts, it's a fantastic portrayal of startup culture. So yeah, that book is definitely going on my reading list. Anyway, Abrams read this book and he was inspired by it. And the second important thing that happened at this time, Netscape had just gone public. And as a result, the internet was about to take off. And Abrams, like so many young techies at that time, and I suppose similar to a gold rush, he just knew he had to be in California. So he sent his CV to Yahoo and Netscape. Yahoo didn't reply, but Netscape offered him a job. And so in 1996, Abrams moved to Silicon Valley. Now, at this stage, Netscape, they had something like 70 to 80% of the browser market share, and it really was the first company that defined how all other internet startups behaved. The culture inside was intense, a real seat of the pants hacker vibe going on, and the concept of internet time emerged, working throughout the night, the belief that product cycles could be measured in weeks, not years. And I've listened to an interview with Abrams, and he talked about how much he just loved working there. And I remember this time as well. I was in my early 20s reading about Netscape, and it inspired me and a group of friends to start our own internet venture. And I know I always mention it whenever I get the chance, but the Netscape story, together with the dawn of the internet, it just inspired so many young entrepreneurs. But Netscape was under siege from Microsoft, just like Jerry Kaplan's Go company, because Microsoft were bundling their own browser, Internet Explorer, free with Windows. And within a few years, Microsoft won the browser war. So in 1998, AOL bought Netscape for $4.2 billion, but I think by the time the acquisition actually closed, because shares had gone up so much, it turned out to be about $10 billion. And I covered this in the episode on Mark Andreessen. It's a cracking story. Anyway, Abrams, like so many Netscapers, he didn't really fancy working for AOL, so he took the redundancy package, gets a job with another startup, but is also working on a side project that became his first startup, Hotlinks. Now, Hotlinks is essentially to take your browser bookmarks, upload them online and organize them into directories, structured directories that other people could browse. Shareable bookmarks, I guess you could call it. An early version of Pinterest is the way I see it. And because this was height of the dot-com boom, it was pretty easy to get investment, and Hotlinks raised $7.5 million. It never really moved into the mainstream, but then again, it didn't really get the chance to evolve because March 2000, you guessed it, the dot-com bubble burst, and that was the end of Hotlinks. Now, Abrams got a job as head of engineering at a mobile startup. That fact alone is pretty impressive because in the Bay Area, after the dot-com bubble burst, between 250,000 and 300,000 people lost their job in the internet and tech sector. So the competition to get any kind of tech job was intense. So Abrams, he must have been pretty good at what he did. And while he was at the startup, he started working on a new idea. One that didn't come from a single moment. It was more of a pattern that Abrams observed. Because like most young people at the time, he'd started trying online dating. You had Match.com, Kiss.com, and he found it frustrating and, in his own words, kind of a bit creepy because everything was anonymous, usernames, unverifiable profiles, and it wasn't just dating sites. You got to remember, back then, the entire internet, chat rooms, forums, message boards, everyone hid behind anonymous usernames. That was just the way it was. And that felt wrong to Abrams because he knew in the real world, you meet people through other people, specifically through friends, through introductions, through networks of trust, I suppose. So he basically asked a simple question. Why doesn't the internet work like this? Well, what if you could map real relationships online? Real people, real identities, real connections. And that was the insight behind Friendster. It sounds so obvious now, but at the time, it was a really radical idea. And even Abrams, he wasn't so sure this would work, but he figured it was worth giving it a shot. And so he officially incorporated Friendster in March 2002. And together with a few friends, they spent the spring and summer of 2002 refining the code, specifically what's called the Circle of Friends algorithm. And that mapped how people were connected. So when you joined, you didn't see random profiles. You saw your friends' friends. And then one step beyond that. Essentially, it was 3 degrees of separation. And crucially, those connections had to be confirmed. When you added someone, they had to verify it. So it wasn't anonymous, it was grounded on real relationships. And this was the breakthrough. This laid the groundwork for all social media that came afterwards. Abrams even filed patents for it, and those patents, as we'll see, would end up being very valuable. So Abrams started testing with a small group of friends and family, and it quickly grew to a few hundred users. And what stood out was who got it. Like people in their early to mid-20s, they understood it instantly, whereas older users in their 30s and 40s didn't really get it. One of Abraham's friends recalled in a podcast I listened to telling a younger colleague about it. And that younger colleague then spent a weekend on it. And she came back and she was obsessed with it. She told her colleague how she'd reconnected with an old friend she hadn't seen in years and even got a date through a friend of a friend on the site, just like in real life. So these early adopters were using it exactly as intended, uploading photos, messaging, connecting. And this must have been a great feeling for Abrams. Proof that not only is your theory working, but it's working better than even he could have expected. So in mid-2002, he raises $115,000 from a small group of angel investors. And one of them is a guy called Ram Shriram. He's a very interesting character because this guy was one of the 3 original investors in Google. I had a quick look at his Google investment because, it's interesting. So Shriram invested $250,000 in 1998. And at the time of Google's IPO, which was in 2004, that was worth $450 million. And of course, we don't know when Shriram sold his shares, but he has a net worth today of $3.7 billion. So it's fair enough to say that he did all right. Anyway, back to Abrams. It's now early 2003. The site is still in beta mode as such, and he raises another $1.1 million from angel investors. And crucially, 2 of these angel investors were Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman. Both the first early investors in Facebook. Reid Hoffman, the guy who would go on to found LinkedIn. Also joining Abrams at this stage was Sean Parker, former Napster founder, future Facebook president. And while Parker didn't have a formal role in Friendster, he was an early advisor and was even given some equity in the company. So right there between them, Thiel, Hoffman and Parker, you have three people who really helped shape the future of social media. They were there with Abrams and Friendster at the very start. So in one way you think, well, how could it all go wrong for Friendster with these three people in Abrams' corner? But I believe at this stage that just like Abrams, Thiel, Hoffman and Parker, they weren't sure how all of this would turn out. They just knew that something big was happening, that this was going somewhere, that they were onto something. But they weren't all knowing at this stage. I believe Friendster turned out to be central to their learning curve. In essence, its failure informed their future success. Now, Friendster officially launched to the public in March 2003, and the growth was immediate. The platform hit 1 million users within a matter of months. But this caused a problem. The servers just couldn't handle the traffic. Pages were so slow to load. And look, you'd think, okay, well, this is a good problem and something that can be solved pretty easily. But back then, it wasn't easy to fix this. Today, you can add more capacity almost immediately. Back then, scaling meant literally calling a hardware supplier, ordering machines with specific specs, waiting for them to be built, driving out to collect them, and physically installing them in a data center. But in those first few months, Friendster was the only social network out there. So despite the slow page load times, people were joining in their tens of thousands, and it quickly became a media sensation. In July, Abrams appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live. The Howard Stern show was talking about Friendster because there was a story where Kathy Griffin said she had to fire her assistant because he was spending hours every day on the site. So, of course, by this stage, there were VCs lining up to get in on the action. But before he sat down with any of them, Abrams got an unexpected visit. Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google. They showed up in person at Friendster's small office, no lawyers, no term sheets. And you got to remember, back then, Google was the coolest company on the planet and headed for a huge IPO the following year. And Brin and Page, they were fascinated by how Friendster was mapping human relationships, and they wanted to buy it outright. They offered Abrams $30 million in Google stock. This is pre-IPO stock, so it would have multiplied many times over the next few years. But Abrams turned it down, and I can see why he would have. He had the top VC firms in Silicon Valley literally pounding the door to invest, and the VCs actually said to him of the Google offer, if Google thinks you're worth $30 million today, you'll be worth $1 billion next year. And more importantly, Abrams could see that his theory of social networks was actually working. The site was growing at a huge rate. People were staying on the site for hours at a time. So I think he had every reason to believe that with the right backers, Friendster would become the next big thing, just like Google. And when he chose his VC partners, on paper, it looked like he had hit a home run because he chose two of the most highly regarded VCs that were operating in the internet space. The first was John Doerr. He was general partner at Kleiner Perkins and one of the most famous VCs ever. Doerr had backed Amazon, Sun Microsystems, Google. The second VC was Bob Cagle, founding partner of Benchmark Capital, and he was one of the first investors in eBay, one of the few internet companies that continued to thrive after the dot-com bubble burst. So between them, they invested $13 million at a valuation of $53 million. Now, what's very interesting about this deal is that as part of it, on top of the $13 million investment, because Friendster was such a hot property, Abrams was able to negotiate a secondary share sale as such, whereby the VCs paid an additional $5 million to him personally for some of his shares. So he was able to cash in, take $5 million off the table. And he still held on to a significant minority stake, somewhere around 30%. So, good news for him, you might think, except for one crucial factor. As part of the overall deal, Abrams gave the VCs a 3-1 majority on the board. In effect, he gave up control. And this, I believe, was hugely detrimental to the company. I've talked about this in other episodes. I believe that in startups, the founder has to have control. They have to be in the driving seat. I mean, yes, bring in senior people to advise and to guide or to mentor, but the founder has to have the last say in all major strategic decisions. And I know we just mentioned Google, and Eric Schmidt was CEO of Google from 2001 to 2011, but context is everything, because when Page and Brin were more or less forced by their investors to get a grown-up CEO, they chose Schmidt themselves after a very arduous interview process. And crucially, Page and Brin never gave up control of the company. Even after going public, their share structure meant that they still held the majority of the voting power. Anyway, back to Friendster. With the VC investment, everything moved so fast, as you'd expect. Suddenly there was an influx of heavyweight Silicon Valley talent, top tech executives with big resumes and strong opinions. And at first, Abrams was very excited. It was validation. The best people want to work here. But it quickly became obvious to Abrams and to those who had been with him from the start that these senior hires, they had their own ideas about what Friendster should be, and they didn't treat Abrams like the boss. One reportedly dismissed him publicly in front of others. Abrams started losing authority almost immediately. Now, why did Abrams let that happen? I mean, maybe he held these high-profile tech executives in such high esteem that he deferred to them. Maybe he just didn't move fast enough to stamp his authority. Maybe these people realised that the ultimate power lay with the board. It was probably a mix of all three. And despite all of the new talent, the fact remained that Friendster's technology was still a mess. Page load times were still really slow. Abrams and his engineering team, they were firefighting, spending 90% of their time just trying to keep the servers from crashing. That was their priority, and rightly so. The board, however, having been burnt during the dot-com bubble by hot startups with great ideas and zero revenue, they were fixated on monetizing Friendster as quickly as possible. So internally, with all of this politicking going on with these split priorities, the company was in a mess. And now we get to late 2003, and as a result of Friendster's huge growth and exposure, other social media websites were launching. And the biggest threat came from MySpace, which we covered in episodes that I co-hosted with Keith. It's a cracking story. So the guys behind MySpace, they openly admitted that they started off basically by copying Friendster. But MySpace had some key advantages. It was launched by an existing online marketing company, and a pretty shady one at that, but that meant it already had servers, engineers, distribution and marketing in place. So without the same technical headaches dragging them down, they had the room to actually innovate. New features kept shipping, like customizable profile pages, music integration. Now, the irony, of course, is that all of these customizations that MySpace had would eventually become their undoing, because Facebook's cleaner, less cluttered, faster loading profile pages ended up giving it an advantage over MySpace. But that was further down the road. Right now, MySpace pages loaded faster and looked fresher than Friendster. And, in the early social media era, that was enough to give it a serious edge. Now, a lot of people also point to the fake profiles debate. Because MySpace allowed fake profiles, Abrams was militantly against them. And yes, being so rigid about it, it did make Friendster look uncool. So that did have some sort of impact. But the idea that users were clamouring for fake profiles, that's largely a media invention. Like Facebook's success alone disproves that theory. Anyway, as 2003 came to a close, Friendster still had the top spot with around 4.5 million users, but MySpace had hit 1 million users, and it was growing faster. It was pulling in a younger, louder audience, bands, musicians, minor celebrities. MySpace was where, I suppose, the cool kids were at. And that was a problem for Friendster, because nearly 70% of Friendster's users were over 25 years of age. So it wasn't losing on numbers yet, but crucially, the momentum was now with MySpace. And what I find striking about all this is looking back from just the $13 million investment in October 2003 is how quickly the window, the opportunity, how quickly it closed. By April 2004, in the space of about 6 months, Friendster went from being the hottest thing on the internet to a company with an identity crisis, a scaling crisis, and a governance crisis that became very, very public. Because on April the 1st, 2004, Abrams walked into a board meeting expecting to talk about growth metrics and server issues, but John Doerr and Bob Cagle had already met privately and made their decision. Abrams was out. The board had lost confidence in him. Too deep in the weeds is what they said. Too much the engineer. He wasn't enough of the type of executive who could scale $1 billion company. I mean, from Abrams' perspective and from the people close to him, the real problem was the opposite, that the company had been taken over by people who didn't understand the original vision and were now making decisions that would end up destroying it. My own view is that Friendster by this stage was probably doomed either way, because even when Abrams was the CEO, he was never really in control. And whether that was structural, the voting rights he'd signed away, effectively making him a lame duck from day one, or whether it was simply a personality thing, it's hard to say. I mean, he was clearly very smart, clearly visionary, but maybe not forceful enough. Maybe he didn't have the sharp elbows that you need. And I don't know. I'm just speculating. What we do know is this. Once the board pushed Abrams out, the buck stopped with them. Everything that came after that, that's on them. Tim Kugel stepped in as interim CEO. He was a board member. He was also former CEO of Yahoo, so he was mentioned in the episode I did on Yahoo. But just on an interim basis, until a few months later, they announced Scott Sassa as the new CEO. Now, Sassa was a former president of NBC Entertainment. He had a fantastic TV CV. He oversaw the development of The West Wing, Freaking Geeks. I remember that show. I loved it. Fear Factor, Law and Order. So I'm not going to dump on Sassa here. He was a brilliant TV guy. But he was totally the wrong hire for Friendster, a social networking company that had a huge engineering problem. And now you have Sassa coming in from NBC with a focus on getting large advertising deals. But this shows you how out of touch the board were. You don't monetize a consumer product until you have the product right. And Friendster, as a consumer product, was still really crap. The load times issue still hadn't been fixed. At a conference a few years later, Sean Parker said the following of that time. We were all screaming, the sky is falling, and nobody was doing anything about it. I mean, that's a classic case of where a company just blew us. And what Parker is referring to here is the technology. It was so bad and not enough focus was being put into it. So by mid-2004, Friendster, it wasn't just losing the battle for new users. Its own core users started leaving because now people had a choice. MySpace was building huge momentum, and then, enter stage right, Facebook. Launched in early 2004, it was cleaner, it was faster, and in those early days, because you could only join with a .edu email address, it had an exclusivity that neither Friendster nor MySpace had. Now, of course, they ditched that after a while, but at the start, this made Facebook the VIP section that only certain people could get into. That summer, Facebook raised $500,000 from Peter Thiel, $38,000 from Reid Hoffman, while Sean Parker left Friendster and joined Facebook to become an advisor to Zuckerberg. So, if you think about what that meant, 3 of the sharpest minds in Silicon Valley, they'd all had a front row seat in Friendster, so they could see the huge growth potential in social media, but they also saw every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment where the right call wasn't made, and they were now in Zuckerberg's corner. So having these 3 people, it gave Zuckerberg a huge advantage, not only over Friendster, but also over MySpace. And look, just to clarify, I'm not trying to diminish Zuckerberg's own input here. He, of course, played the biggest part in Facebook's overall success, but he did start off with a dream team. So by early 2005, the numbers start telling the full story. Friendster has somewhere between 7 to 10 million users, but the site was only getting 1.1 million monthly unique visitors in the US. MySpace had 22 million monthly visitors. Facebook was at 5 million monthly visitors and growing fast. And then Friendster had another problem. It had kind of accidentally become massive in Asia. particularly the Philippines, to the point where roughly 50% of their traffic was now Filipino, which might sound like growth in one way, but it wasn't the type of growth they wanted, because now American users were logging on, seeing a platform that no longer reflected their social world, and leaving. And as a result, advertisers who were willing to pay for American eyeballs were losing interest. In May 2005, Sasa resigned after exactly 1 year. The board, finally accepting that the product was the problem, brought in a guy called Tae Kwan. He was a tech and product executive. And in fairness, Kwan, he did fix many of the technical issues and launched a redesign that added features that people wanted, like blogs, better profile customization, essentially kind of copying what made MySpace successful. But the game was already over. Friendster had lost its momentum, and it wasn't going to get it back. A good analogy from that time: Friendster was trying to fix its engine while the car was already in the scrapyard. 6 months later, the board got impatient with Kwan, sacked him, brought in a new CEO. So that's 5 CEOs in 3 years. That is, for want of a better word, a real shit show. That same year, MySpace was bought for $580 million by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and just like Friendster's board before them, Murdoch thought he knew better. He brought in top media executives, but they had no feel for social media whatsoever. Although it still took 4 years until 2009 before Facebook overtook MySpace, which really shows how big MySpace had become. And because of that, MySpace's demise was even a bigger failure in management than Friendster's. Anyway, back to Friendster. Over the next few years, it limped along, surviving on Asian traffic. And I was surprised by this number, because they had real traffic of about 80 million users at this stage. But from a revenue perspective, it was low rate display advertising, and it wasn't generating the returns the investors needed. So in December 2009, a Malaysian company bought Friendster for $26 million. And then they turned around and sold its patents. Remember, the ones that Abrams filed in early 2002? Well, they sold these patents to Facebook for $40 million. Facebook bought the patents as this legal shield, I suppose, to protect itself from potential lawsuits as Facebook scaled its own social network, which was built on very similar underlying ideas. So that was their reason for doing that. Friendster was then converted into a gaming portal, and it eventually closed down in 2015. Now, as for Abrams, he actually left Friendster in 2005. And over the years, he's launched a few different startups. The most successful was Nuzzle. This was a very well-regarded app that aggregated news stories on Twitter and Facebook. Nuzzle was sold, but I couldn't get any numbers. He's also invested in over 50 startups, so he's been busy. And I've listened to interviews with him, and he really comes across as such a normal, smart guy. I mean, yes, he's a bit frustrated at how Friendster panned out. They had first mover advantage in the social media sector, and they blew it. While Facebook, or Meta, is now worth $1.4 trillion at the time of recording. But as Abrams said himself, it's hard to feel sorry for yourself when you're a millionaire instead of a billionaire. And I really like that. And I think he can take a lot of pride from the fact that he was right. His idea as to how people interact online was right, and it became the blueprint for social media. And in terms of how did it all go wrong, I mean, Abrams and particularly the board, they made a hames of it. But at the same time, you can kind of understand how none of them were really prepared for this. Social media was a totally new phenomenon. It's kind of understandable that the first crowd who came across it would make a lot of mistakes, and others, as happened, would learn from those mistakes. As Keith, my former co-host, was always fond of saying, pioneers get the arrows and settlers get the land. Anyway, it makes for a fantastic story. And that brings us to listeners' emails. And this one is from Sarge, who suggested that I do a story on Li Juan, the founder of Xiaomi. And that's actually the company spelled Xiaomi. I never knew how to pronounce it. Anyway, Li Juan, he wasn't on my list. So thanks a million, Sarge, for the recommendation and for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.